So thanks everyone for coming, and thank you JJ for still showing up 20 years later to be my hype woman. So basically today we're going to talk about interview prep. Yeah, I know we're old. So here's a little bit about me. So I grew up in Florida. I grew up about 30 minutes north of West Palm. I went to Stetson as an undergrad. That picture is me in my 2006 graduation. Trust me, I look the exact same now. After I graduated from undergrad with a management degree, I moved up to Chicago and I worked in talent management and recruiting for about 5 years. And then I went back to school and I got my master's in organizational and counseling psychology at Adler University. After that, I worked with Loyola University in Chicago. I did career advising, I did academic advising, and then I also taught a career course for the Quinlan School of Business. And it was that career course that actually led me to getting recruited by the Eisenberg School of Management, which is UMass Amherst Business School, to come and get their sophomore career course off the ground. So I did career advising for them and then lectured in their career kind of department, and now I've been at BU and the Questrom School of Business for about 5 years now, doing kind of like Liz said, I do career service work as an assistant director with them, and then I also am a lecturer in the organizational behavior department. So that's a little bit about me, so you kind of understand where I'm coming from. I really got into the career advising space because having that recruiting background allowed me to understand a little bit more about, well, why are recruiters looking at something this way? How are they approaching your resume? What's the purpose of these questions? And that insight really drove me to be able to helping students kind of break some of that down, and hopefully that's what we'll do today. So thinking through kind of the whole process, interviewing is really this kind of cyclical process. And it's this whole thing that you will do every time that you basically submit a job and kind of go through everything. The big parts are kind of that middle 3 pieces. So the interview prep, what you do while you're in the interview, and then what you do after the interview. So we'll kind of start breaking some of these down. And if you have questions as I'm going, please feel free to chat them. I'm happy to answer them as I go. I'll also leave plenty of time at the end. And Liz and Olivia, if I miss anything, please feel free to interrupt me as I keep going here. But let's talk about the process. So basically, you have your first steps. So I know we're doing a interview kind of talk here, but if I can just get on my resume soapbox for 1 minute, you should always be submitting a tailored cover letter and resume. If you're using the same resume, cover letter, CV, what have you, for every application you're doing it wrong. There's always an opportunity to tailor your documents, make sure you're mentioning skills, using similar words, and your cover letter always should at least at a minimum be detailed to the company that you're applying to and the position that you're applying to. I will get off that soapbox now, moving back into the interviews. So basically, once you submit your documents, you'll get told that you've been selected for an interview. Traditionally, these happen kind of either on campus or off campus at the employer's site. Now you're going to see these starting to be probably more virtual interviews, at least until we kind of understand what are going to be the impacts of COVID and what's that going to look like moving down the road. Traditionally, you'll see kind of different types of interviews. Often you're going to kick off with a phone interview, which is going to be given by an HR recruiter and a representative from the company in some capacity, a campus recruiter. But this is usually a first round, and they're really just going through kind of those basics. Did you remember applying for this job? Do you meet the minimum qualifications? Why are you interested? Again, it's usually a 30-minute quick phone call. Sometimes we're seeing assessments start to come up a little more, replacing these. Assessments can be, spatial assessments. They can be numerical assessments. Sometimes we're even seeing assessments that are canned video recordings. So it'll be a recording of someone asking you a question, then you record yourself answering that question, and then that video gets packaged and sent to whomever is doing some of the first round reviews. Now you're seeing a lot of virtual, so whether it be Zoom, a Skype, a Google Hangout, again, it's really just replacing that in-person with that virtual capacity. The in-person was your most common, again, on-site, on campus, but it's really kind of you and someone else in the room and going through the interview process. Sequential was really common, so especially as you got into second rounds, super days, things like that, you would see multiple back-to-back interviews. This is slowly starting to be replaced by panel interviews, which is multiple interviewers at once and one of you in the room. The reason for this is really it's become a big time saver and then a big money saver. So instead of spending 4 hours talking to 4 people, I can now have you talk to 4 people in about 45 minutes if we do a panel interview. Group interview is basically the opposite of that. So it might be 1 or 2 interviewers in the room, but then several of you interviewing. The trick with a group interview is really just make sure that you're doing the things that make you feel comfortable and there. You don't have to answer every question, but also don't get talked over on every question. I always tell my students in a group interview, make sure you achieve. Don't overachieve, don't underachieve. Hit your achieve. Behavioral and case are your 2 types of interviews that you'll usually get. Behavioral is the most common, and these are really designed to kind of understand what are the behaviors, what are the skills, how did you react to something in the past, because the employer believes that that might be a scenario or a situation or a skill or behavior that you're going to encounter in this role, and what you did in your past is pretty indicative of what you're going to do in the future with it. A case is a little bit more common in certain industries. Anytime you're doing any consulting interviews, you'll see this. They're becoming a little bit more common in finance, marketing. They're more so in the business world, but we're slowly seeing them matriculate into other areas too. If you ever have a case interview, the trick with those is you'll typically get a scenario of some sort, and then you have to ask follow-up questions. You have to explain how you're kind of thinking through the problem and what you're explaining it as. Case interviews are kind of a beast all into their own. So for this one, we're mostly focusing on the behavioral side. So when you go to an interview, you're always going to prepare for it. And this is the biggest part. So always know the basics. Where are you going? If you're going somewhere, do you know how to drive there? Have you run it in Google Maps with traffic and without traffic? Have you budgeted in time to get lost if you're really bad at directions and you're going to get lost in a circle? If you're going to a city, have you figured out if you're going to take public transportation? What do you know about it? And then what are the specifics? Do you know the building you're going to? What floor? Are there any requirements you need to know for parking? Do you need to get a security badge before you come that you need to add 10 minutes before you go? And then obviously, who do you ask for? Now that it's virtual, do you have a link? Do you need to download a platform? Are there passwords that you need? Making sure you have all of that basic information set. Then it's going to be your questions. The end of every interview should traditionally involve something about, well, what questions do you have for us? Always ask them questions. We usually say prepare around 5 to 10, usually because you're going to get some of those answered as you go through the interview process, but you always want to have something to ask at the end. Then bring the things that you'll need if you're being in person. So bring extra copies of your resume, bring questions if you're someone who likes to take those notes. And then if they've asked for other documents, maybe samples, references, whatever the case may be, make sure you're bringing those and then also bringing some extra copies too. And importantly, practice this. Practice in your head, practice with your friends, practice in the mirror, practice with a career coach. Whatever you can do, make sure you're practicing these because it's really good to hear yourself pace it, to get some of these thoughts into sequential order. You're going to want to walk through this a little bit more. In order to do that, you have to do this more poignant research. So now you've figured out the basics, but here's where the nitty-gritty comes in. So you have to research yourself. Look at your resume. Think about the experiences that you've had and what are stories you want to tell about that? What do you want the employer to know from looking at those? This is your opportunity to talk to them and become more than just this one-dimensional piece of paper. So think about the stories you want to tell, the skills you want to highlight, all the things that you want to convey about those experiences you put on paper. Then it's also the employer. You will always get asked, why do you want to work at this company? Why do you want to work in this specific position? So you really want to know that information. Why do you want to work at that employer? What is it about what they do, their culture, things you've heard from friends who have worked there, things you've heard from reviews on the internet, whatever it might be, but really thinking about why that specific company. Then obviously the opportunities. So what is it about that job description that made you want to apply to it? What are the skills that you have that you feel like really mirror up to that? Make sure that you either save the job description or you save the link to the job description because you always want to go back and review those before your interview to make sure you're really talking about the things that are important for the company and for that role. When you go to an interview, the interview starts the minute you walk into the building. So especially in large offices, you're probably going to meet an office manager, an administrative assistant. They are absolutely part of the interview process. When I did recruiting, the first person that I always talked to was my administrative assistant. I would go out and I would ask her, how were they whenever they came in? Did they talk to you? Whenever you offered them information, were they acceptive of it? Did they have a conversation? It's always that old saying of the things you do when no one's watching matter the most. They absolutely still matter and are still a part of the interviewer. Typically, you're also going to have an interviewer or someone come out to get you from a reception area of some sort. And so when they do, make sure you stand, make eye contact, have that strong handshake, introduce yourself. You're likely going to walk to an office or something like that. So make sure that you're able to make the small talk, stay away from those taboo topics, but really just everything is part of this process to it. In the interview, traditionally it's going to start with a tell me about yourself, walk me through your resume, something that's really kind of teeing up to let you have the floor. So make sure that you, again, know that job description and know what do you want to highlight? What are things that you feel like are relevant on your resume? Then they're going to talk about some of the questions. Again, they'll either be behavioral, it'll be a brain teaser, it'll be a technical question, but the interview is really going to kind of start after that. Tell me about yourself. Then you're getting into some of those more poignant questions. If you're virtual, same exact thing. So all the things that you would do and prepare for an in-person, you're going to do those same exact things. Virtual just changes the modality in which you're interviewing. It doesn't change how you interview. So make sure that you're troubleshooting the system. So if you have prior access and you know that you're going to need to present something, do you know how to screen share? Do you know how to take questions? Do you know how to chat? All of those things are important. And it's the same things that you would do if you're in person. So make sure you're dressing professionally. And if you're one of those people who only wants to dress professionally from the waist up, please remember to not stand up. Pretty embarrassing to see you in your boxer shorts. No one needs to see that. But also make sure you have a neutral backdrop and be in a quiet place for recording. So if you're in a dorm room, can you go somewhere else? Can your roommate leave? Whatever the case might be, but making sure you're giving yourself the best possible environment. And again, still the same interview. Don't overthink it. Something will probably go wrong with your technology. Your internet will go out at the exact moment you need it to work. You will mess up a screen share and share the wrong page. It's okay. These things happen all the time. Everyone's still adjusting to this new virtual capacity. Don't let that hang you up and don't let that trip you up as you keep going through everything. My biggest trick is when you're doing this interview, treat the camera like a person. So make sure you're staring at the Oculus. A lot of times in whatever platform, it'll have different pictures and we all get drawn to the picture of ourselves because we all want to make sure that we're looking good, we're looking like we should, but that can usually lead you to not maintaining eye contact. So as you look at the camera, make sure that you're looking directly at your Oculus and that gives the vision of this eye contact. Some programs will push your picture lower, so otherwise you look like you're having a conversation while you're staring at your feet. No one wants to do that. So make sure that you have all the pieces there and then conduct yourself the exact same you would in person. Use enthusiasm, use gestures. I can't not talk with my hands, so you probably see these popping up in my screen all the time. It's exactly how I would talk if we were in a classroom or you were in person with me. Bring the same enthusiasm and bring the same demeanor because ideally, this whole virtual thing is going to come to an end at some point, hopefully. And so they want to make sure you're still a fit with the team, that you're still the type of person they want to see in the office. And so all of those things you can still convey, even if it's virtual. If it is going to be virtual and if you are distracted, try to rid the screen of your image or at least move it up closer to the Oculus so that you can at least see everything that's happening, but still maintain a sense of eye contact to it. Types of questions. So usually you're going to start with these basic getting to know you type things. Why did you choose Stetson? Why did you choose your degree? If you could be any appliance, what would you be and why? Things that are just kind of fun, get to know you sort of things. Then your behavioral ones start. Tell me about a time you worked with a team. Tell me about a time that you took initiative. Tell me about a time that you had to utilize adaptability. Then your advanced ones, that's where you come into case, some of your technical questions, your brain teaser questions, how many golf balls fit in a 747. The advanced questions, sometimes there is an answer if it's a mathematical one, of course, but there's other times where they're just really looking to see kind of how do you react, what's your thought process, how do you kind of start to pick apart a solution, where are you starting to drive to with some of these things. Here's really common interview questions. Traditionally, when I was doing recruiting, these are the type of things that I asked. These are also still the types of things that we're hearing employers ask students. So you'll usually see these sort of things to it. Again, for something like if you were an animal, which one could you be? No one is really asking you to think about, oh, well, gee, really, what animal would I be? They're designed to, one, get you to think on your feet, and two, get you to let in some of your personality to it. And then how many golf balls can fit in a 747? To my knowledge, no one has actually tested this one to know yet, but it's again about, well, how are you rounding your numbers off? How are you averaging these things out? What's your thought process as you go through all of these? So it's not about necessarily getting the right number so much as how are you getting to a number and why do you feel like that's the right one? So here's your really common questions. Tell me about yourself. Again, usually you're going to open an interview with that, or walk me through your resume. You're really going to answer it the same. So it's kind of thinking about an umbrella. How do you want to group things? I always tell my students, start with the present, past, future. What are you currently doing? Currently, I'm a sophomore majoring in blank. Currently, I'm an alumni who recently graduated with a degree in blank. Okay, great. That gives a little bit of the stage. Now tell me the next part. I've done internships in blank. I've been involved in blank. I've built skill sets in blank by doing blank. Giving a little bit as you're starting to now structure what do you need to know? What's the information you're trying to make sure they know? And then what are you looking for? Why did you apply to this job? What are you hoping to do in the next 5 years? Where are you taking your career? Kind of trying to group some of that together into a little bit of a pitch about yourself. Why are you interested in this role? Use the job description for the job itself. What are the skills? What are the experiences? How do you fit that? Why were you excited about the opportunity? And for the company, what is it about this specific company that you're interested in? Is it the mission, vision, and values? Is it the product? Is it the culture? What I always tell my students is try to think about this in two ways. For the job itself, if you could do this, if you could work at this company, why do you want to work in this specific role? And then for the company, if you could do this specific role anywhere, why do you want to do it at this specific organization? These questions are really the big differentiating factors. They seem pretty simple to it, but you would be surprised at how many times people kind of gloss over these. Especially when I was recruiting during the kind of 2008 downturn, these were your make or break questions because this really showed who intentionally applied to a job, who intentionally put in the research and prep for this interview. And these were the things that really mattered as you were going through it. Let's say, hypothetically, that you've applied to something, you're like, I don't know why I like that role. Find something. So find, is it something about the company's mission? Is it something about the company itself? But really find something that excites you about it. And if you still can't find anything, that's probably not an interview you should go on, to be realistic. Strengths and weaknesses you will get all the time. With your strengths, don't just rattle off things. Don't just say, I'm a good communicator, I'm tall, I once played volleyball, I know how to count to 10. Really cool, good for you, but maybe not necessarily things that are relevant to it. So instead, relate it to the job, again, using that job description, and then give kind of short snippets that can back it up. So you say that you're good at teamwork, great. At Stetson, I've done a lot of team projects. I recently volunteered with blank. I'm in an XYZ organization. This helped me build my communication skills because I'm always emailing students, emailing whomever. Showing kind of quick snippets that support that. Again, you don't have to get long into detail, but giving a little proof of your pudding. For your weaknesses question, this can be the biggest stumbling block. Do not give them strengths as a weakness. We always call that, don't give them the Michael Scott. Don't give them the, I work too hard. I sometimes get overcommitted. I like this job too much. Those are actually strengths that you're just trying to pose as a weakness. And if it's something that is unrelated to the position, great. But if it's related to the position, try to stay away from that. For example, I had a student once who we were talking about how his interview went. He was interviewing with a financial services company. They asked him what his greatest weakness was, and he said, I really am not good with numbers. Okay, possibly true, but maybe not the best answer in that scenario. So it's really thinking about what are things that might be a real weakness, but not necessarily impactful of this specific position. Examples of a good weakness that I've heard students use would be that they are typically introverts. And so being the one to first contribute ideas doesn't feel comfortable for them. So they're really usually someone who likes to frame their ideas, then participate later in group meetings. to combat this and make sure that group members understand that they're not just waiting to contribute or not contributing at all. They talk about kind of their MBTI types or their personality types, things in the beginning that really help understand this. So things that you can contribute but aren't necessarily negatively impactful to you. And the most important thing with your weakness is always talk about what are you doing to combat this or to kind of help it be a better part of your working style. For behavioral questions, you're always going to approach it. You probably have heard STAR, you've probably heard SAR, BAR. These are all really getting at the same thing, but anytime someone asks you a behavioral question, you always want to answer with the situation of the task, the action, and the result. So what's some information that they need to know for the background to follow the story? The action is typically what is going to answer the question, so what's the skill they're trying to assess? And then what's the result? What happened because of all of this? Usually, a good behavioral story is not going to get too far in the weeds of your situation. It's going to give me a little bit of context so I can follow through with you, but not so many details that I'm lost in what we're talking about. Again, the action is going to be, okay, so you had to take initiative to solve the problem. This is what I did to solve the problem. And then what's the result? How did it all turn out? Did it work? Did it turn out poorly? What was the reasoning for all of this? Giving them something that helps shore up, well, how did everything happen? Really closes that story. So you want to give them just a quick story, again, nothing too long, but nothing too short that it doesn't feel like you really were able to paint that picture in their mind for them. Oftentimes, you can take multiple answers from one experience. So if you're thinking, well, I don't know if I have an experience for that, you probably do. I always use an example as an academic team project. A lot of times in classes, we do group work, and so there's so many things that can come from that. The time you worked on a team, when you managed a conflict, when you had to present to a group, when you had to manage multiple deadlines, using strong communication skills. There's so many things you can take from that, but I will say the caveat to this is don't use the same experience for every answer. Ideally, you've probably worked on a team more than once. Ideally, you've probably managed a conflict more than once. So try to bounce around and utilize your entire resume instead of just focusing on one experience to try to answer all of these different areas to it. At the end of the interview, so again, when they've said, what questions do you have for us? This is where you get to really find out more about, are you a fit with the company? Is the company a fit for you? Is this a role that you're really going to be interested in? And you do that by asking these questions at the end of the interview. If you have a lot of questions and they haven't answered some of those through the interview, you can ask how much time is left so you're able to prioritize for you. Oftentimes, at the end, the recruiter should wrap up by telling you what the next steps are. If they don't, that should always be your next question. What are the next steps in the process? What does your timeline look like for your hiring? When should I expect to hear from you next? These are ways that you can start to understand a little bit more about what's happening after this particular interaction. After your interview, you always want to send a thank you note via email within 24 hours to each person that you met with. So if you met with a panel, each person in that panel is getting a thank you note. If you met with multiple individuals, each individual is getting a thank you note. If you're someone who likes to handwrite thank you notes, just remember in this time, you may have issues with maybe the office doesn't have employees currently in, maybe the employees don't want to open mail because of germ transfer. So just be aware that there may be some implications where a thank you note that's handwritten may not always get read, but absolutely you can send that email, and then you can even still send a thank you note on top of your email if you want. That's totally fine too. Oftentimes, companies are going to have multiple rounds, so after you do the first round, there's going to be a second round, sometimes a third round, but you're going to do the same exact prep for every round that you. And then at the end of it, it really comes down to a 50-50. You have the offer, you don't have the offer. If you do get the offer, make sure that you review all of the components before accepting it. What's the salary? What are the benefits? Where's the location? All of that information. If it's a no, be gracious, still thank them for their time. You never know where your paths could cross again in the future. And if possible, one of the things I really encourage students to always do is ask for feedback. I'd love to know any feedback that you had if you're able to share it. I think that's a great way to learn a little bit about maybe there's mistakes you're making, or sometimes it's that you didn't make any mistakes and it's just one of those things where there was a lot of competition and someone just happened to have better experience, just happened to fit a little bit better. Great, that's also good to know that you didn't do anything wrong. It's just a matter of this one didn't happen to work out. When you're sending thank you notes, they shouldn't be lengthy. So in an email, you should never have the recipient have to scroll. If they're having to scroll for your thank you note, they're probably not reading all of your thank you note. So make sure that it's pretty quick, but you're still getting that information in there. And each person should receive a detailed thank you note. Your thank you note should always be personalized, mention something that you and that person discussed. So again, when you're asking those questions at the end, what did they answer about? Is that something new you learned about the company? Did you have a side conversation with them at a lunch, at a dinner, before the interview started? Whatever the case might be, to try to reference something specific that you talked about so they remember you and you're able to jog their memory a little bit. Make sure you restate your interest in the company, the position, continuing with the process, and whatever you do, do not just copy and paste this, and if you do, please proofread. I can't tell you how many thank you notes I've gotten that are actually addressed to my colleague or actually addressed to my manager. So those are things where you want to make sure you're putting in the extra work for it, and it's really one of those kind of things that can differentiate people. Overall, when you're doing an interview, I think tips to make it great are to be personable, authentic, enthusiastic. One of the things that we always said when we were recruiting, and that I hear from recruiters now, is it's not just a matter of can you do it. If you've made it to the interview process, you absolutely can do it. Based on your resume, I know you have the skill sets. But what I'm trying to assess in the interview is, are you the person that I want to do it with? So making sure that you're able to show you're a fit with the company, the culture feels good for you, the team feels like a fit for you. Those are the things you're trying to convey as well. If you can make the interview conversational, again, that's just showing kind of an ability to highlight communication skills, to feel more comfortable for you. And again, a recruiter isn't designed to be a robot. They're a person too at the end of the day. So being able to talk with them really just makes both of you feel like you've had a conversation instead of this kind of ping pong match a traditional interview can sometimes feel like. If you put it on your resume, it is fair game to talk about. So if there's something that you didn't have a good experience with, that you're not excited about, consider taking that off your resume so that you don't have to bring it up in an interview and you won't get questions about it either. If, again, doing your research, you want to talk about why you're a good fit at that company for that role, really drive home the reasons that you fit a certain role, the experiences that you have, the skills that you have, the passion that you have that aligns with the company. These are all things that, again, I'm trying to figure out, are you the person that we want to do this role? Skills-wise, I know you can do the role, but do we want you to do the role? And always stay positive. I know this is a really tricky one, especially when tell me about a time you failed, tell me about a time you experienced conflict. It can be a little bit tricky in those scenarios, but the recruiting world is very small and industries are actually very small, even though they feel big. Most likely, a recruiter knows somebody at another company or they themselves have worked there. There's whatever scenario you can think of, but you always want to try to stay positive. That way it also shows a little bit of grace for yourself, and it's always a way to think about what you learned from a situation, not just that the situation was negative. One of the big things is be okay with pauses in the conversation. That feels like a long time, but that was only 6 seconds. So those are the things, especially when you're virtual, to keep in mind that sometimes the recruiter may be taking notes if they're over the phone. Pauses are going to happen as they're thinking of questions, or virtually as we're waiting for each other to finish. It can feel like a long time, but it isn't that long in reality. I paused for 5 seconds and it felt like about 10 minutes. If you can't think of an answer, again, it is okay to pause. Sometimes you can even ask for more time. That's a great question. Do you mind if I think a little bit about how I want to answer that? That's a really good question. I have a couple of stories that I'm thinking of. Would you mind if I took a minute to think about which one would fit the answer best? That is fine, but you cannot use that every time. I was in an interview once, and again, I just started the interview. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Great question. Pause. Is that a great question? I feel like you should expect that question. So making sure that you're not using it all the time, but you can actually own, I need a minute to think. How can I think about this a little bit longer? That's okay. But again, remember that 6 seconds feels like a long time. So use pauses with grace and use them when necessary. Oftentimes, if you can't get close to something, or if you can't get exact, get close. What we mean by this is maybe I'll ask you a question about, tell me about a time you had a conflict with a manager. Maybe you've never experienced a conflict with a manager, but you've experienced a conflict in a group setting, with a team member, with a coworker. Great, you can own that. You know, I've been lucky enough to never actually have a conflict with a manager, but at one of my previous internships, I did have a conflict with a coworker, and here's what happened. So getting them close, even if you can't be exact. Most importantly, be prepared, do your research, know what you're interviewing for, know the things that you want to talk about, and give yourself grace. You are going to mess up on an interview question. There is going to be something that as soon as it's coming out of your mouth, you're going to want to reach back and grab and put back in. That happens all the time. I promise you though, no interview has ever been made or broke by 1 or 2 questions. It is okay. The most important thing is don't let it trip you up. So don't let one bad answer throw off your headspace that you can't answer any of the others. You're human. There are going to be issues. There are going to be things that you wish you didn't say. That is okay. It's about how you bounce back from that. One of the examples that I always use, I was in a job interview once and they gave me a bottle of water. At the end of the interview, I was like, yeah, I am nailing this. I'm doing so good. I went to grab the water, take a drink. I knocked the water off the desk, onto the person's computer, onto their paper, and I was like, well, I should just see myself out at this point. And that is the story of how I ended up with my first recruiting job. I'm sure that knocking the water over isn't what secured that job for me, but it was about the grace. Yep, that happened. I can't do anything about it now. I can't put the water back in the bottle. I can't rewind time. All I can do is apologize, laugh about it, and luckily they were also very gracious about it. And we're just like, well, this will be a memorable interview. It definitely was. So it's okay. Give yourself grace, even in the worst of circumstances. Now, I tried to wrap up pretty quickly. What questions do you guys have? Whether it's a specific one for you, overall, hit me with anything that you got.
Ronnie, if you got a question, you can go ahead and put it in the chat box.
Oh, okay. So, well, let me make sure, Robert. So, do you mean like asking them at the end of the interview, what are your hesitations for asking or for giving me this job? Or do you mean like asking for the job, like in the first interview? I'm going to answer both. So I've had a lot of students, especially for sales jobs or financial jobs, like investments, things like that, things where you're expected to really be able to kind of ask the hard questions, to be able to sell yourself a little bit. I think that it's a great question. I don't know if everyone has to ask that question. I always tell people, are you comfortable asking it? If you are comfortable asking them, what hesitations do you have for hiring me? Great, ask that. It's a great way to know what they might be. But if that's something that really makes you uncomfortable, that's going to carry through whenever you're asking. And that's something I would say, if you don't feel comfortable asking it, don't force yourself to ask it. Whenever you're asking the interviewer questions, I think there's always things about the company, about the job itself, about the team. So for example, you know, on the job description, you said that there would be extra projects as assigned. Could you give me some examples of what projects people have done in the past? I know that the company recently merged with XYZ. What do you think that merger is going to have as an impact on the culture? You know, if you could design the perfect person to join your team, what 3 qualities would you want them to have and why? So asking things that are going to help you get a little bit closer to one, knowing what you might want to talk about in your next round interviews, and also, again, assessing that company, assessing your fit, assessing what you might bring to the table. I think those are always really good things to know and be able to ask. Counter offer suggestions. So I think if you have an offer on the table, absolutely, you can always talk about that with them whenever you get an offer. But I'd say always wait until you have an offer to be able to counter offer or negotiate anything. It's better to know the terms of everything that they're giving you. And then if you are doing a negotiation, I always think it's totally fair game to at least ask about negotiating. You may not be able to. Some companies are pretty firm about, this is the base salary, these are the benefits. We don't discuss this until you've been on the job at least 90 days or a year. Okay, like that's just the way some of the companies work. But I always think it's a fair game to ask, I reviewed the salary and the benefits information, and I was wondering, is the base salary something that's negotiable? That's always a great place to start. If they say yes, great. Make sure you're negotiating based on your skill sets, based on what you bring to the table, based on all of those things, because those are the things that will impact the company's bottom line, and those are the things that are thus impactful to them. If you try to negotiate based on, well, I was really hoping for blank salary because I wanted that salary, good for you, but it's not necessarily going to be something impactful to the company. And then if you are able to say, I was recently offered a role for blank, I was wondering if you could get a little bit closer to that salary, sure, that's totally fair for it as well. So personality tests. I'm a really big MBTI fanatic, so I am probably skewed in that. I really like the MBTI, mostly because I think I also come from a business background, and for a while that was how a lot of business leaders were grouping teams and everything. But there's a lot of them. What color is your parachute? I think there's strengths-based Gallup, I think was mentioned previously. So I think there's a lot of different ones you can take. I always think incorporating those results into basically interview questions, strengths and weaknesses. For example, I'm a really big extrovert, so I like talking to people. I like thinking on my feet. I like creating solutions as I'm going. But similarly, those can also be weaknesses to it as well. I'm a really big P. In a world of business, everyone is typically J's, where they're very ordered and organized, and I'm someone who likes to get a little bit closer to deadlines to become energized. So that can be a conflict that can sometimes start. But I think those are great ways that you can bring them in, especially in ways where you're talking about yourself and kind of opening how your personality can fit a company, can fit a team. Those are great attributes that I think are easy to work into it. The only caveat that I will give with personality tests of any sort or assessments is really, these are not indicative of what you can, or can't do. They're just insights into you and how you may behave. So don't feel like, oh, well, I came out an ENTJ and that says that I can't be X, so I shouldn't apply to that role. Nope, that's not what it's saying. It's really just saying that your styles may be easier for this, but it's not saying you can or can't do anything. Do situation questions have to be tailored to the specific job? Okay, so I think for situation questions, typically they may be related to a job, but I think especially now that you're talking about kind of this wider COVID pandemic and things like that, absolutely, it can be anything. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at with if you can't get exact, bring them close. So if they say, tell me about a time you went through a difficult situation, or tell me about a time you had to, make a difficult decision. Great, this is absolutely a place that you can tap into for it. I think really what they're looking at is, well, what did you do in that situation? What were those behaviors? What was your kind of thought process through all of those things? And whatever story you can give them to articulate some of that, whether it's from an internship, whether it's from personal experience, whether it's from a class project, where it comes from isn't as important as the what you're trying to get at. And so I think absolutely it's totally fair game. I would always just caveat of whatever you feel comfortable sharing. So if there's something where you're like, well, this is a really personal story and I don't know if I want to get into that, don't feel like you have to bring that to the table. It is always up to you what you share. The only, I guess, exception to that would be if you discuss something on a resume or potentially in a cover letter, that's kind of fair game for them to ask you some questions about. But I think absolutely, you could totally talk about a current tough situation that you're going through, anything like that, as long as you're still getting at the answer. Great, it's an awesome answer then, and you're able to articulate and tell me a little bit of that skill set or that behavior and that ability that I'm looking for.
All right, guys, if we have any more questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat box. All this has been awesome, and I love your example questions, Trish. In the meantime, while people are starting to think about any more questions they may have, I'm going to drop the cultural credit link into the chat box. So make sure if you're here, if you would like cultural credit, you fill out this survey. My computer would cooperate.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, cultural credits are way easier to get. Thanks for pointing that out, Jace. So using the STAR method for creating a resume. So what I would actually say is think about using the STAR or BAR method or anything for creating bullets on your resume. I think especially when you're looking at, well, how can I highlight blank skill set? It's always important to tie into that bullet, well, what was the result of that? Or how did you impact that, right? So sometimes I'll see on students' resumes, I was an administrative assistant, so I filed paperwork. Okay, but did you use a specific software system to do that? Did that have a result? Did you increase the efficiency? Did you have to do it to help create a new department? What are some of the more components to that? Because just filing the paperwork, well, it's a valuable skill set. It's probably not all that there is to it. So by bringing in some of these other components about it was to increase efficiency, great. That's also showing initiative. That's also showing that you understand some of the impacts of your other work. So being able to use kind of that STAR or BAR method a little bit within a bullet, I think is a great way to start building content on your resume. Ideally, some of that background information. So, I was working with a professor. I was working with the Coca-Cola company. That's often carried by the company title and what your kind of internship or work title was there. So instead of saying, well, when I was working as the marketing specialist at the Coca-Cola company, that's already covered by those first two parts. So then it's just your bullets. So yeah, absolutely using that outside of just interviewing on a resume and a cover letter. Those are all great areas you can use a similar ideology for it.
These are great questions that everybody has come in. I'm going to go ahead and drop the cultural credit survey link in one more time, but keep the questions coming. We have time for more, so don't hold out.
Is there still the art studio that you can go to for cultural credit?
The museum, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. That is one of the many ways.
Yeah, not saying I did that a lot my senior year, but hypothetically, I might have done that a lot my senior year.
Walk through.
Ooh, good question. So common mistakes people make during interviews. So I think one of the biggest mistakes is just not being prepared. I've seen it a lot in interviews when I'll say, why do you want to work at this company? And they give me a very good roundabout answer. I'm really excited about working in blank industry. I'm really excited to get my feet wet in blah, blah, blah. Okay, but that didn't really answer my question. And it's very indicative that the reason you didn't answer my question is because you don't actually know a lot about my company. What are my mission? What are my vision? What are my values that I'm using? So I think those are really the big things. If a student just gives an off the rails answer, that happens. A lot of times it's nerves, it's things like that. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily totally failing on a behavioral question, getting a technical question wrong, not being prepared for a weird brain teaser question. Those are all what we used to call forgivable mistakes. Those things happen. Maybe you're nervous. Maybe it's just kind of something that you were thinking of one thing and another thing came out. those are human errors anyone can get behind. But I think it's really when it's going wrong is when someone comes in maybe too confident, so kind of thinking that they already have the job and so they're not necessarily treating the interview appropriately, or someone misbehaves during an interview. Typically, we've seen that happen more when it's like a dinner, a lunch, a networking event, something where they forgot that they were part of the interview process, or again, just not being prepared for it. The only other time that I would say there's a bad answer is if I ask you, tell me about a time you experienced conflict, and you launch into a diatribe about how your manager was the worst manager, and then you drop their names, and there's all these parts where it just feels kind of awkward to it. But otherwise, it's really just as long as you're prepared and as long as you're trying, you're not really going to do poorly at anything. I think, yes, you can always look someone up if you have that information on LinkedIn beforehand. I think that's really interesting to know, well, have they been with that company long? If they have been with that company long, what are maybe prior positions they've been at the organization? If they're new to the organization, where do they come from? Have they been in that industry a while? You kind of get a little bit of sense of who they are. I think that's also a great way to form questions you can ask the interviewer at the end. You know, I saw that you recently switched from marketing to financial advising. Tell me a little bit about how you made that transition. Thinking about some of those things that can kind of help you, one, feel comfortable in the interview, or two, have some questions that now you can prepare to understand a little bit more about, well, why do they work there? What's kind of the reasoning that they've stayed with the company or potentially moved into this company from another one? I think those are great bases for questions. If you know someone who works there, I think it's great to mention it on a cover letter at least. In the in-person interview, I think there's easy ways to drop that in, especially at the end. My friend Alex works here, and he mentioned that he really likes the culture of blah, 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 blah. Could you tell me a little bit about what this team does to make sure that that's still a component? So kind of dropping in different ways. And then in group interviews, again, I think the biggest thing is just making sure that you're not being overshadowed, but you're also not taking up all the space in the room. And I know that feels like a pretty thin line to walk, but I think it's really important to be part of the conversation without monopolizing the conversation. And I think an easy tactic for that is if you have a strong answer for something, or if you have an opinion about something that you wanted to share, great, share it. If you're just going to repeat something, try to add something else onto that. And I also think try to use their names whenever you say it. So ideally, you're going to be in like a 4 or 5 person group. Try to use their names. So try to say, you know what, JJ, that's a great point. I was actually thinking for cultural credits, not only could we now attend webinars, but what about the walkthroughs and everything that we used to do? So kind of adding something to it additional is a great way that you can also not overbear the conversation, but give your thoughts in addition to what you're looking for to it as well. Can I share your PowerPoint? I don't mind if you guys share it. I believe Liz and Olivia both have it. They probably have your email address that they can send it out to you. Am I promising things though, Liz, that you guys can't do?
We can do that. We'll get you guys the PowerPoint and the recording as well. So just stay tuned.
Yeah. And I will also just make a quick plug. The career office has so many good resources. When I was preparing this presentation, I was trying to think of, well, what does Stetson have that I maybe want to make sure to call out, or that I don't necessarily just kind of repeat information. I know this is a lot of information that the career office at Stetson has kind of already had available, but I think it's always good to hear it from another perspective. And I would always encourage you to access your career services, whether you're an alumni, an undergraduate student, whatever the case might be. Career services are built to help make you be more successful. And so accessing them for mock interviews, LinkedIn feedback, questions about how to walk through something, your resume, these are all really important pieces that create the whole picture of you. And that's exactly what you want to give to a company, is the best possible picture of you.
Awesome. And that was music to Liz's ears, for sure. All right. One last time, I'm going to drop in. Oh, goodness. I'm going to drop in the cultural credit one more time for anybody who may have lost it in the chat box. And I'm also we have another cultural credit opportunity next week. It's Webinar Wednesday on change management. I'm going to drop that information on how to register in the chat box as well. So hopefully we will see you there. And thank you everybody so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun and practical and reassuring, everything you want to hear. But you did get into the nitty-gritty, so I like that. It was awesome, and thank you so much.
Anytime. Thank you for asking me to participate, and thank you everyone who came and hung out with us.
Yes, thank you.
Love you, Jays.
And while we're wrapping up, feel free, if you need anything else, you can stick around. We'll wait around for just a second. If not, thanks so much for joining us, and have a good evening. Hope everybody is staying safe and healthy. So like I said, if you have certain questions for our speaker, you can stick around and we can maybe unmute you or unmute your camera if you'd like. If not, we'll see you later. I love, Trish, how you were able to Stetsonize the PowerPoint. Loved it. Loved the touches.
Not my first rodeo of customizing the PowerPoint.
I loved it. The whole thing. I'm just over here like, yes, like everything, every single thing. I'm just like, keep going because it's so spot on and awesome advice.
Yeah. So just to answer the question, challenges interviewing in the pandemic. So to be fair, what we've kind of heard from, I'll say at least the employers in the Northeast that Boston University works with and that I work with, currently employers don't know what they don't know. So for example, a lot of employers are planning on recruiting, they are planning on hiring still, they don't necessarily know the numbers specifically. So for example, before the pandemic, it might be that Ernst & Young was hiring 40 people and taking 60 interns. They knew that coming into it, but now they don't necessarily have those numbers. I think you're also seeing a shift of companies trying to understand, do we make this be how we operate continually, or do we make this be kind of short term? A lot of companies were just looking at, well, how do we make sure we handle the employees we currently have before we think about what are we adding, how are we adding them? So I think you'll see a little shift, but the recruitment and everything will still be there. You will probably see an uptick in competition for that, most likely, just looking at kind of the unemployment rates, the graduation rates, everything like that. But that doesn't mean that you have to compete harder. It just means competing smarter. And so I think that's where kind of talking about tailoring your resume, making sure that you've figured out what are the keywords from that job description that you can put in your resume. What do you want to talk about in your cover letter that's specific to that organization and specific to what their company is looking for? In the interview, making sure that you've done your research, making sure that you're highlighting how you fit this specific job, why you're really excited about joining this specific company. Those are the things that I think really make a person stand out. Again, kind of coming from that framework of recruiting during the first downturn in 2008, those were those big make or break factors, because I would post up a job and I would get 400 applications. Of those, 200 were probably intentional, 50 maybe fit the job, and so now I had to whittle it down from 50 further. And typically how I did that was interviews, looking at their documents and really making sure that someone was intentional about applying for my job, intentional about their fit for it, and then when I spoke to them, they were intentional about the time that they were giving to me. And so I think those are kind of the ways that I would say standing out is something to do now. There's also a bunch of other ways, networking, looking at LinkedIn, looking at alumni that are at a company, cold reaching out to people. There's a lot of ways that you can kind of find out more information, but I think from the standard application speak to nothing process, again, be tailored and be kind of thoughtful in your research and really making sure that you're showing that this was an intentional document for you, an intentional application, and you're excited about the opportunity.
Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you guys.
This
This
has
is
been
great.
great. This is awesome. This is so cool. Great to virtually